So I'm going to talk about Snare in a bit, but first I want to ask, does anyone remember the 2008 global financial crisis? I don't, because I'm Australian. I'll tell you who definitely remembers the GFC. Iceland, suffering a housing collapse, a stock market collapse, and a government collapse. Now, a full explanation of exactly what happened before and during the crisis is obviously beyond the scope of this video, but here's a Cliff Notes version of how Iceland's banks crashed the economy. So basically the scheme is, the bank has billions of krona belonging to the public. It takes those billions of krona, lends it out to its own shareholders. Those shareholders use those billions to invest in stocks in the bank, which puts the money back in the bank, but now the bank's stock price goes up, effectively creating wealth for the bank by just moving money around. It's the kind of too good to be true money for nothing scheme that makes you think, wait, in what scenario is this supposed to not crash the economy? So drunk with power, the bankers start lending out billions of krona without collateral to their mates, who then invest the money overseas, the equivalent of 100 billion US dollars, an amount that was 7 times larger than Iceland's GDP prior to the crash, was invested by the banks and their shareholders in foreign companies, real estate, and soccer teams. Now you might be thinking, how was any of this legal? Surely there were regulations in place to stop banks from behaving like this. How on earth did it get this bad? Well, it's complicated, but the short version is, in 2001, banks were deregulated in Iceland. So by October 2008, all 3 major Icelandic banks had defaulted on the equivalent of 62 billion US dollars worth of foreign debt. Investors fled the country, the krona collapsed by 50% in a single week, the stock market plummeted 95%, local Icelandic businesses went bankrupt by the thousands, house prices sank, and mortgage costs doubled. While in countries like the USA, the government was busy bailing out its banks, in Iceland, they literally didn't have enough money in the country to be able to do that. So instead, they took the sensible route and began jailing the bankers. Where was I going with this? Oh right, this is a book review. This context provides the backdrop of Snare, a crime thriller about 2 women trapped in desperate circumstances in the fallout of the GFC. Sonia is a recently divorced mother who is fighting for custody of her son. Since her ex-husband had been the provider of the family, Sonia found herself with no income after the messy separation, and in the wake of the 2008 crash, she couldn't find proper work either. In a desperate bid to get the money she needs to be able to provide for her son, Sonia turns to smuggling cocaine for a shady lawyer who approached her about fighting for custody. However, it isn't long before she finds herself trapped in the world of crime, and her lawyer turned criminal boss begins using threats against her son as leverage to keep her under his thumb and continuing to smuggle his drugs. Sonia must use her wits to avoid arrest by international customs, find a way out of the snare, and retain custody of her child. Sonia is also in love with a woman named Agla, who is the head of investment at one of the banks that sank the Icelandic economy, and she and the rest of her banker friends are under serious criminal investigation. Not only that, but said rest of her banker friends might end up throwing her under the bus to save their own sorry hides, and they have leverage to get Agla to go along with it. Meanwhile, Agla's wits are pitted against investigators Jon and Maria, who gradually uncover more and more information, meaning Agla and her fellow conspirators have to be careful about what each of them say when they're all grilled in separate police interrogations. Agla must find a way to protect her own personal secrets while also avoiding prison and being outplayed by her fellow conspirators. This high-stakes thriller weaves these 2 stories together beautifully. Chapters are short, maybe 2 or 3 pages on average, and perspectives are swapped between regularly, making this novel very easy to get through. Even if you can't spend much time reading in a day for whatever reason, the chapters are short enough that you can easily get through multiple in a brief reading session. I loved how the story was structured. Scenes and events are breezed through swiftly. There's very little fluff to these scenes, and yet there's enough time still spent staying in slower moments, developing either the characters or the themes to let the reader mull over the details at a comfortable pace before ramping up the action and intrigue again. This is to say that the pace of the novel is spot on, which is good because there are a lot of interwoven plots, characters, and motivations in this story, and the expertly crafted structure of this novel makes it very easy to follow and understand. That being said, an issue worth mentioning in this book has to do with one particular scene in the middle of the story that features a Latino character named Jose. Jose is high up the chain in the drug cartel and takes pride in his nationality. He's only in the book for one scene, but his character stands out from the cast as leaning into negative stereotyping. He's the kind of violent, ruthless, cartoonish drug cartel boss that you might find on a show like Narcos, and I wouldn't really think that he's worth mentioning except that he's the one and only Latinx character in the entire book. So having him also be this barely thought out cliche violent psychopath drug boss is a bit tasteless, to say the least. I think it's more likely to be carelessness on the part of the author rather than malicious intent, but I'm interested to hear feedback on this from anyone else who's read the novel. While Sonia smuggles drugs into Iceland, she's found herself in the sights of an experienced customs officer named Bragi, who is de facto the third main character of the story. Bragi is 69 years old. Okay, behave yourselves now. And is under pressure from customs management to retire. However, he really doesn't want to because he needs to be able to afford to get his Alzheimer's-stricken wife out of a nursing home where he suspects she's being abused by one of the staff. However, his manager is getting impatient because of the economic situation. There are some young, hungry, and desperate people who need jobs, and Bragi, stubbornly holding on to his, despite being well into the age range where people are expected to retire, is seen as selfish by the younger members of customs, which is damaging the morale amongst the staff. While he considers his options, Bragi begins noticing Sonia's frequent trips through the airport, and begins to suspect her of drug smuggling. Instead of handing her case off to his higher-ups to deal with, Bragi decides to deal with her himself, and goes beyond the beck and call to catch her in the act of smuggling. Bragi's decades of customs experience is pitted against Sonia's planning and strategy in what becomes a high-stakes battle of wits. Bragi is a crucial element of the heart and soul of this story. Not only is he just this sweet old man trying to do what's best for his sick wife, but he actually provides an excellent contrast to the two female leads. Both of the leading women in this story are criminals. They are bad people, maybe for understandable reasons, but nonetheless, this front and center lesbian romance is between women who lie and hurt people. And lest we forget that fact, Sonia is pitted against the wits of sweet old Bragi, who relies on experience and deduction compared to Sonia's trickery and deception. Sonia has strategies in place to avoid getting caught with the cocaine, but it's clear that this experienced customs officer is onto her, and she only needs to slip up once. Having both of the leading women being criminals of various stripes, almost anti-heroes even, is such a fun element to this story. It was genuinely exciting to witness the constantly rising tension of several plots involving secrecy, backstabbing, and politics heat up to a boil as the novel went on. Both Sonia and Agla's respective snares tighten around them as the story progresses, and it's very nerve-wracking watching events conspire to keep them apart, even as they try to manage the internal conflicts of the relationship. Personally, I found their romance to be an incredibly enriching part of the story, and the difficulties it faces both from without and within provide more than enough conflict to get the sense that the odds are very much stacked against these two lovers to end up alive, free, and together by the end of the series. Oh yes, by the way, Snare is the first book in the Reykjavik Noir trilogy, which also consists of the two sequels Trap and Cage, which I haven't read at time of recording because I'm on the clock for getting this video series out. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue this book series, mostly because my reading list is so long these days. However, I found Snare to be satisfying enough on its own that I am confident saying that I enjoyed my time with it, and I recommend it to anyone interested in a high-stakes crime thriller from a culture that doesn't usually get a lot of attention from the mainstream literature scene in English-speaking countries. This book is moderately popular, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. I managed to snare the last copy in a Tasmanian bookstore, and I'd encourage you all to purchase this novel from a local independent retailer if possible. If you have trouble finding this book in stores, I've linked several online book retailers in the description that I recommend, such as Better World Books, Alabris, and Blackwell's. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing, clicking the bell, hitting the thumbs up button, sharing it with your friends or on social media, leaving a comment. I would appreciate all that a lot. Thank you so much for watching.